YouTube, but we should be live now, I think, most likely.
Sweet.
So Tim, thanks
Hey,
for
man.
coming on. Appreciate you taking time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Tim. I'm out of Nashville. I guess I consider myself an evangelist first. I'm not a pastor. I do go out and do some street evangelism and things like that here in Nashville, sharing the gospel. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of what got me in apologetics a little bit. So I'm only an apologist so far as a tool for that. I've got a small YouTube presence called Conversations with Christians. It's just kind of an outlet when there's something I want to talk about. I'll post it up there. Facebook page, the same. I'm also probably the neatest thing is part of this group here in Nashville called the Conversation Coalition. It's a group of atheists and Christians, and we get together on a monthly basis and host dialogues, like public forum dialogues on different topics. So we'll have an atheist and a Christian talk about. We just did one last week on grief and loss. And so we talked about how we navigate grief and loss from our different worldviews. That one wasn't so, apologetic-y or debatey. That was more learning. That was fun. But that's a really cool thing. It's kind of new. We're trying to get more people to come out. We do it in public venues. We've done it in a church. We've done it in a coffee shop. We've done it at a bar. We did a round table at a bar where we just invited anybody out and got the tables together and hash some stuff out. So that's pretty cool.
That is very cool, actually. I would love to partner with you guys, try and get one going here or come to Tennessee sometime, do one. That would be awesome, because that is a really cool thing that I'd like to try to start more consistently around the country.
Yeah, and there's Secular Rarity. I don't know if you know him. He's on the Atheist Experience. He's a regular host there. He's one of the members too.
Cool.
Some other Sydney Davis is on Talk Heathen. So she participates, and we're pretty much doing it with no budget and, just saying, hey, we're doing a conversation here. Here's what we're talking about. And then invite people to come out. And the biggest goal there is because we have atheists and Christians, right? And yet, so what unifies us in that mission? And what we hope to display is that we want to demonstrate that you can come together with your family, your friends, whoever, have cordial discussions about important topics without, necessarily being hostile.
Sure.
So I guess you could call it an experiment.
Definitely. Do you guys use meetup.com, the social Eventbrite kind of stuff?
I don't think we've advertised it there yet. We Conversation Coalition is on Facebook. It's on Twitter. I think we might even be up on Instagram too. But we haven't advertised via Meetup, which might be something we want to consider.
I think I found the YouTube channel or the Facebook for it. Conversation Coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, so I invited you on to have a similar conversation here. I am an atheist, which means I believe that there isn't any evidence for the existence of God. I assume you disagree with that.
I do.
So what would be some of the things that you would consider evidence?
I think there's a lot of good evidence. Obviously, we would disagree there. But the first thing that draws my attention over what you just said. So you're not, and I'm happy to share evidence. I'll do that in just a sec. But just to clarify for me, you're not just an atheist in terms of simple lack of belief. Like do you feel like you've got some positive claims there in your atheism?
Yeah, so I am more philosophical minded. So in the philosophical community, atheism typically refers to the belief God does not exist rather than the lacking of belief that God does exist. Yes, we have good reason to lack or to reject the existence of God, namely that there's no evidence for such a thing, or there's equivalent evidence to magic leprechauns or the normal analogies. I think so for the same reasons we are justified in rejecting the existence of those things, Santa Claus, Loch Ness Monster, we are equally justified in in rejecting the existence of God.
Okay, right on. Yeah, I hear. I think I hear Spider-Man is the kind of one of the popular ones right now in terms of the reliability of the Gospels and things like that. We can go there, but essentially, I believe there is good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Christian worldview is necessarily true, and that when we look at the facts of the historical evidence, it or anything historical or any piece of knowledge at all. Only the Christian worldview justifies the kind of knowledge that we would need to have in order to know facts, kind of period. So I've got a little presuppositional bone in me as well, as you might imagine there. But I really enjoy talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. We're on Easter was yesterday, so it's kind of a relevant topic too. But everything from the necessity of the Christian worldview to have knowledge to some of the facts, the historical facts around the resurrection. I think a lot of atheists kind of show their bias in the way that they handle some of those facts. But that's just kind of a quick overview of why I believe that the Christian worldview is true.
Cool. So what would you think is the most interesting thing to start with?
The most interesting thing to start with. So I guess we'll start with the resurrection. So you, I'm sure, are familiar with Habermas and his minimal facts approach.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at some of the minimal facts that he puts together, and they change sometimes, but like Christ was a real person. Do you agree with that? Christ was a historical figure.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Christ was a historical figure. He died. Was crucified on the cross. He died. He really died. That he appeared to his disciples. That James and Paul had conversion experiences. They were, radical skeptics, disbelievers before, and they experienced something that caused them to radically change their life to the point that they were willing to risk and die. That the resurrection was proclaimed early. It wasn't a later development later on in the first century. It wasn't a development in that sense. And that other things came into play too, like thousands of Jewish people broke from their historic tradition of worshiping on Saturday to worshiping on Sunday. So that's some of them, and there are more than that, of course. But I'm curious from your standpoint, when you look at that, because TJ, I know you've been in the game for a while, man, and I've seen your stuff before. And there's probably nothing new that I'm going to be able to say to you that you haven't heard before. But what I'm curious is, how do you, when you see those things, do you question them as historical facts to begin with, or do you express, some other different conclusion other than Christ must have risen from the dead?
Yeah, I'd go with a different conclusion. Like, all those are pretty mundane as far as I'm concerned. It's pretty standard that those kinds of things happen to any starting religion that's popular anywhere in the world, as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm.
Like, could you give me an example?
Pretty much every starting religion has visions of their deity, usually after death. This is very common throughout history. It's a trope or whatever. Many people have lots mass conversions where lots of people change their patterns and previous cultural things. Like Mormonism was one of the fastest growing. Scientology. Both of those had people thousands and thousands of people who converted to these very strange ideas which were completely contrary to the previous culture. Those are all really common. So pretty much all of it is common for the most part. The only thing that's missing would be the death part, because in today's culture there's not really many people who are killed for beliefs. In very few places in the world that occurs, or at least a minority of places,
for sure.
Right. And so it still happens. There are still people who are willing to die for their beliefs, and they usually do in those cases. And so there's not really comparative religions that we can go to say, oh, well, they were willing to die and it grew, because usually they're killed and the religions are stopped at that point. But it's a pretty common among ideology, all the things you listed. I don't think there's anything special about those that would indicate a supernatural origin.
Yeah. Well, I got to disagree with you a little bit there for sure. I mean, in terms of Mormonism, you have Joseph Smith who receives a private revelation off by himself, which he then takes back and communicates to groups about, hey, this is what I was told. This is the information I learned. And he did it alone. With Islam, Muhammad goes into a cave, receives revelation, again, alone, that the scripture before him has been corrupted, what they call the Injil. He goes back, can't even write it down. His wife transcribes the Quran for him, which is more closer to the Book of Mormon than the Bible, how that came about. But the contrast there is that the ministry of Jesus was very public for 3 years. There was seldom anything private that occurred unless it was him teaching his disciples head on. And so I think that's a big difference. His crucifixion was public, his death was public, his ministry was public. And then not only do we have people that did die for their beliefs, I'm not going to argue that all the apostles died. I think we have good evidence for at least a few. But it's different than, say, like 9/11, a jihadi flying into the Twin Towers, because people do die. I do agree that people do die for things that they believe is true. That happens all the time on all different kinds of convictions. But the uniqueness there is that the disciples and the apostles in the first century were willing to die for something that they personally witnessed, for an event that they swore that happened. And so I think that it might seem like a subtle difference on the surface, but really that's something majorly different in all those categories.
Well, to me, none of that seems significant at all. Like the fact that the first vision came privately to Joseph Smith or something, like that doesn't matter. Lots of Mormons have claimed to have visions corroborating, or angels that they talk to. Lots of what was the other one you mentioned? Islam. Lots of people have
Muhammad in the
had
cave,
visions from Muhammad, and so it's extremely common for people to have visions, whether it's together in a room
for sure.
or a single individual. And so there have been analogous events where Mormons and Muslims have collectively had some spiritual event where a bunch of them together experienced something, and so which would be exactly analogous to what the apostles did. The fact that it wasn't the first event makes no difference. Does it matter that the first event was private versus the 10th event? Like, no, I don't think so. That wouldn't add any credibility one way or the other. So I don't see that as any significant at all.
Yeah, but I disagree on just the nature of that. What you're describing as visions. I think the historical evidence, even non-believing scholars would grant that the historical evidence shows that the disciples saw Jesus in the same sense that you would see somebody in the grocery store that that you knew, and it could have been anybody, but in that example. In the nature of visions that you're describing, I agree that would be problematic, because you're talking about different visions, and I'd be curious to see what kind of group hallucinations or whatever it is that's out there for Islam. I'd be interested in that for sure. But again, I think the nature seems to be different, and even skeptical historical scholars agree that there was a genuine belief that the disciples and the apostles saw Jesus in some kind of a natural way post death.
I've heard that a lot from Christians, but I don't understand why they think that's significant. Because again, that's extremely common. We have names. We have dozens of names for those exact kinds of delusions: bereavement delusion, communal reinforcement, folia do, multiple people seeing the same thing. Like, that's extremely common. There's nothing special about that whatsoever. So the fact that a bunch of people had delusions, which they came together and came up with a story that then was corroborated to be the same thing, that's something that we've known and could explain neurologically for decades. And so I don't see how any of that would be significant.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. And any historical evidence that I put out like that, anyone can always just say, I can't satisfy that for you. I think it's a good case. I didn't even, this is where I think it's really interesting. I didn't necessarily bring up a miraculous event or supernatural. You were actually the first one to say that. But one of the things I think is inconsistent, at least from an atheistic worldview, and this is fun, man, exploring these things. I think it would be more consistent to say, yes, the historical evidence does point to the fact that the apostles, the disciples, did see Jesus after his death on the cross, without necessitating necessarily a miraculous event. Because I'm not even invoking that. And I feel like it should be easy to say. I mean, why couldn't you say, yes, the evidence does seem to suggest that the apostles saw, or at least believe that they genuinely saw the Christ alive, in the same sense that you'd bump into somebody in the grocery store, not a phenomenal vision except for Paul. And yet we can't explain it, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a miracle.
Well, no, I do. I 100% agree with that. That was actually what I was saying before. Bereavement delusion is that. Bereavement delusions are seeing or hearing or interacting with someone who is dead in what people perceive as the same sense as seeing someone at the grocery store. So that's a known delusion. We 100% know that happens all the time. 60-something% of old people experience these delusions. This is incredibly common. So I do exactly grant those things are real, because they're very common today.
Why you jump to the delusion?
It is a very known, extremely common phenomenon that explains exactly what you're describing. So it'd be like if someone
it's not T-jump, man.
what do you think it's not?
For someone to radically change their life to risk of life of limb, not only an individual, but multiple people based on something that they encountered specifically. I don't know why you just said why it's. Are you saying that must be a delusion because some other individual somewhere else it was demonstrably a delusion, and therefore the appearance of Christ was a delusion?
Um, what I'm saying is that there is a known phenomenon that humans where they can see people who have died, just as like they see someone at the grocery store.
Mhm.
And this is something we've proven to exist, has tons and tons of empirical evidence. And then you give me an example of someone who's seen someone who's died. The most rational thing to do is, well, hey, do we have evidence of another phenomenon that does exactly that? Yes, here's one that does exactly that. What's the cause? Is it that thing that we have tons of evidence for that does exactly that? Or is it some other thing we have no presumable evidence for outside of this example for the sake of the argument? It's like if we go to a forest and we see a hoof print in the snow and we think, well, what could it be? A horse? We have lots of evidence of horses. Horses create hoof prints, probably a horse. And then someone comes along, well, why not say a unicorn? Well, because we don't have any evidence unicorns exist. We have tons of evidence horses exists. And so the best explanation of what caused the footprint in the snow, the horse. And in this case, bereavement delusion is an extremely common thing,
Yeah.
like horses, that causes exactly the phenomenon you're describing, where people see or touch, talk to, physically interact with dead loved ones.
Yeah, I don't go for the unicorn analogy, of course, but uh, bereavement delusions, I agree that's a real thing, but not all of the figures that we have historical evidence for witnessing Christ were experiencing bereavement, or at least I don't see historical reason to think that they were experiencing bereavement, especially Paul and James, which historians experienced, a radical conversion. I don't see any reason to think that they were experiencing bereavement. So I think that's a problem for the bereavement
Well,
hallucination
pause there
theory.
for 1 second. So, because
Sure.
there's two different groups of people here. One are Jesus's direct disciples, right?
Right.
Their leader just died. That's bereavement. So, like all of them, you got bereavement on that side pretty easily. Their
Mhm.
holy figure just died. Pretty easy to explain bereavement. And those are the only ones that um, are the best cases for the seeing a direct human figure. Like Paul, he saw a bright light in the sky or whatever, right? He didn't actually see the physical body of Jesus. He saw some spiritual something or another. And so the only people who did supposedly see Jesus's body in the physical sense that you're describing seem to be the apostles, who would clearly be experiencing bereavement delusion or bereavement.
Nah, again, I grant that bereavement is a real thing, and I get what you're saying about the apostles experiencing bereavement delusion. But the likelihood, and I'm willing to consider some science on this if you've got it,
Sure.
of a number of people experiencing the same bereavement delusion. Because I'll say, sure, they were all experiencing loss. That's actually recorded in the Bible, right? They're embarrassed. They are, as far as we know, John is the only one present at the cross because the other apostles are often hiding. They've just spent 3 years with their life with somebody who they believe to be Messiah or is leading them down that path, and then he dies. So there's case for bereavement there, but I would be hard pressed to believe, and I think psychology would probably follow this too, that you would have that number of people that experience the same bereavement hallucination or delusion, to use your language. And so I think bereavement visions occur. I'm sure it's a naturally explainable phenomenon, but in groups like that, I mean, hey, if there's some data out there, and I'll be happy to go look at it after this. I'm not sure that is possible or likely in the same nature. And then to discount Paul, you are right. The appearance of Jesus to Paul was different, but we still see the radical conversion, and it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the bereavement thing, that's for sure. We
Well, it
do
does
see.
actually, but just wanted to focus on the strongest ones first.
Well, why would you say
Um,
that Paul he's was
bereavement
not a
happens
Christian? He was not
in
following Jesus.
bereavement happens in many ways. He was persecuting Christians. So another common example where people experience bereavement delusion was like Nazis who were persecuting and killing Jews. The act of killing other humans has a drastic emotional effect on human beings, and by persecuting a specific group, you can actually have visions of their deity. So Nazis can have visions of Jews as they killed them, or Japanese soldiers could have visions of Jesus or what they thought Jesus looked like from persecuting Christians in Japan. Very common. So there's bereavement delusion also comes in those forms as too, but that's a separate topic.
But you're assuming Paul was in bereavement. I mean, you're saying that there are scenarios that where Paul could possibly be in a state of bereavement. I don't really know that we've got text, historical or otherwise, to suggest that he was experiencing bereavement. It certainly is possible from somebody that experiences that. Um, but
Well,
but
bereavement can be a subconscious thing, so whether or not we had notes of it doesn't really make a difference. All that matters
oh,
is
so you can just say somebody was bereaving, even if there's no evidence to suggest that they were.
if there's evidence to suggest they're doing something drastic that has a significant emotional impact that can cause those exact phenomenon, like we have evidence that people who were killing lots of people experience bereavement delusions. Yes, we have lots of past evidence of this. That's a good reason to say, is this a potential explanation for that? Yes, because we have tons and tons of examples of this exact thing happening, even though we have no recorded examples of this person experiencing bereavement or whatever that is. We saw that they experienced bereavement delusions. So even if they're not like
Hmm.
expressing that they're fighting with this, maybe they enjoy killing people, they can still experience bereavement delusions, because bereavement delusions aren't specifically you feel depressed, therefore you see a delusion. Bereavement delusions are you have a powerful emotional response going on in your brain, and those kinds of emotional responses can cause firings in your brains that cause these delusions. It's not you're feeling sad, therefore you feel a delusion. It's much more complicated than that. And those feelings don't necessarily need to come from bereavement. They can
Hmm.
come from all kinds of feelings. There's these kinds of delusions happen all the time for lots of reasons. But I wanted to go back to the apostles, or the multiple. You asked, is this something that happens to groups of people? The answer is yes. Also extremely common. It's called folie à deux is the French name for it. It's multiple people seeing the same hallucination. Folie à trois, or whatever, however you say three in French, happens again, and it happens for multiple people. And there are bigger numbers of it happening, called communal reinforcement. Communal reinforcement is where people experience something, and then as a collective, when they talk about what they experienced, the story gets more cemented, more fixed together, and that story then becomes a shared experience they all had, even though it may not necessarily represent the actual experience. So, like this was done with car crashes, where um, there's a group of test subjects. They're put in a location. They created a car crash in front of them, and then they isolated everybody. And they asked them, "Well, what did you see?" And none of their stories corroborated. And the reason they isolated everybody is because of communal reinforcement. If they allowed them to talk with one another,
Hmm.
the stories would get cemented or centralized into a single story that would not have these differences. And so um, this phenomenon of communal reinforcement happens in the case of Ouija boards, ghost sightings, where there's a bunch of people in a house, they're doing this experiment, something weird happens, and then one of the people say it was a ghost, and then they all magically cement on this experience. They all experienced a ghost. And
Yep.
any additions they add into the story, well, they all experienced this addition, even if it didn't even happen. And so now you have this eyewitness testimony of 10 people of this magical ghost lifting a cup 10 feet off the table and flipping it on its head, even though it was just like the wind knocking it over or whatever. So communal reinforcement also extremely common
Sure.
for groups of people to experience the same kinds of bereavement delusion, which will then be cemented into a singular story. So
Okay.
also extremely common.
Do you think it's also just as common to have what did you call it? Communal what?
Reinforcement? Communal
Communal re
reinforcement is more common than bereavement delusion.
Okay. So do you think it's also common for communal reinforcement or bereavement delusion to occur, and also the people that witnessed it and experienced it were willing to go to their death to swear that it was as a natural event as the rising of the sun? Would you say that's also common?
I don't know, because I've never actually researched that. Because from my perspective, whether or not someone is willing to die for a belief has absolutely no credibility to the truth of the belief at all.
No,
So
that I agree. I agree. But I already mentioned that. So people, this is different. So it's one thing to say I die for a conviction I have or a belief. It's another thing to say I'm willing to die for something that I swear that I saw, that I personally witnessed. Because people die for what they believe all the time. No
sure.
problem. I'm with you there. But we're kind of building this stack higher and higher, talking about bereavement. When then we're on to communal bereavement, saying that's common. But then I think we're getting less and less common to the point where we're saying communal bereavement, to where we must assume there was bereavement too, because there were some factors that might drive it. but then also willing to go to the point of pain or death to back up the claim that they made. And I think that there's some, there's a case there that's to be considered for sure.
Well, I don't see why that's important, because like whether or not they were willing to die for it, does that how do you think that increases the probability the belief was true? Because like I can give you examples of even more people willing to go to a deaths for a belief that was similarly unjustified. When Columbus came to America, he asked the American Indians to give him food. They didn't have enough food. They'd starved to death because they had a limited amount. And they said no. He said, you have made my God angry. And in 2 weeks, he's going to block out the sun because he is angry at you. And being a very educated man he was, he knew when the eclipses were happening, he knew when eclipse was coming. So 2 weeks later, sure enough, sun got blocked out. The Indians were scared to death. They genuinely believed this. They genuinely knew this was going to happen. And they went to their deaths because of this belief by giving their food away to Columbus, and they starved to death.
Yeah. So the nature of the claims, though, is different there. You've got a scenario where Columbus says something's going to happen. Obviously, he understands it and they don't. And so he's got a leg up on making this prophetic prediction, right?
Sure.
But a prophetic prediction is not the same as a person who's confirmed dead, speared in the side, nailed in the hands, beaten, and then rises later. Furthermore, you would agree that the eclipse is a natural event that was going to happen anyways.
All right. So the point here was not, I understand that their belief was different, but the point here is the fact that they're willing to die for their belief relevant? Well, no. Like, does the fact that they were willing to die make it more likely that God was angry, like Columbus said? No. If they weren't willing to die, let's say they said, nah, we'll let your God just do whatever he wants. Would that decrease the probability that God was angry? Well, no. It makes zero difference whether or not they're willing to die. It makes no difference at all to the credibility of the claim.
Now, again, but you're simplifying what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's just that they are willing to die for something they believe. It's something that they experienced and witnessed. Now, you could align that with the eclipse. You could say that eclipse. But if you're going to do that, why can't you just say Jesus was alive again? The evidence points that Jesus was alive again, and we just don't understand the natural process that brought him back to life.
You could say that. I just think that there are better explanations of things that we do have evidence for. There are natural things that we know exist that explain fully the phenomenon. And so you could always say let's suppose we had no evidence of anything that could possibly explain this. You could go with the two possible explanations of maybe God exists, or maybe there's some unknown natural law or something, or maybe it was a magic unicorn. And those would all three have equal evidence, which would be zero. And you could say that. I would never do that. I would only go with things that have evidence. And bereavement delusion has a ton of evidence. Communal reinforcement, a ton of evidence. So if we're looking at a footprint in the snow, I'm going with the horse, because we know horses exist. Horses are common. Horses explain this phenomenon. And that's the only reason I'm going with the horse. I wouldn't pick a unicorn over a fairy, because both of those have no evidence. So you're right. You could suppose that there's some unknown law of physics that could potentially explain Jesus's rising that has nothing to do with God, but it's equally as unsupported as saying God exists. But I still wanted to go back to that one question.
Okay.
Why does the fact that them willing to die for it, whether or not they specifically saw it or not, I don't see that as being important. So but let's say they specifically saw it and were willing to die for it. Why does that matter? This is something that Christians say a lot, but it seems to make zero sense to me at all, because whether or not someone's willing to die for it because they saw it or not makes zero difference to the truth of the claim. Like, say I specifically said that 1 + 1 = 2. But I'm not willing to die for it. Say Nazi comes up to my house, says 1 + 1 = 3. I'm like, yes, it does. 3. We're going with 3.
Yeah.
Does that decrease the plausibility that 1 + 1 = 2? Well, no. But let's say I am willing. I'm saying 1 + 1 = 3, and I'm willing to die for it. Go up to the court, say 1 + 1 = 3. Light myself on fire. They disagree. Like, haha, are they self-immolated because 1 + 1 = 3? Does that make it more likely that it's true that 1 + 1 = 3? No. And does it make a difference whether or not I see it? No. None of those examples.
Mathematics is conceptual. I mean, this is not the same thing as witnessing a physical event like seeing somebody in the grocery store.
Well, that's the example is irrelevant. I could
Because
see anything.
what's what you propose, man? I mean, I could say, yeah, I could, somebody. I mean, I could. You could convince somebody that 1 + 1 does
Well,
not
so you can
equal.
pick anything you want. Let's say I saw my dead mom in the grocery store and I'm willing to die for it. Does that increase the probability that the statement "I saw my mom in the grocery store" or that she was actually there true? No. Let's say I'm not willing to die for it or I won't die for it. Does
It
that decrease the probability it's true? No. It has literally zero relevance to the statement or the truth of the statement at all. It's just completely unrelated. It's like saying I had a nose hair or I had a booger in my nose at that time period. Does that increase the probability that it was true? No. Does it decrease the probability it was true? No. It's just completely irrelevant. And I see the fact that they're willing to die for their belief equally as irrelevant as whether or not they had a booger in their nose at the time. I literally am unable to understand why Christians think the fact that they're willing to die in any way indicates that it's true. Now, I grant it indicates they believed it's true. 100%. They believed it's
Mhm.
true. I grant that wholeheartedly. But does it actually mean anything towards the truth of the claim itself? No, it's completely irrelevant.
Well, in a sense, it doesn't add anything to the truth of the claim itself because it's either true or false. It either happened or it didn't. When we're trying to look back and assess a historical event that occurred and our ability to understand what we are interpreting today is true or not. So
Right,
it's either true or false,
right.
regardless of our ability to discern its truthfulness or its falseness.
Oh,
So
right, right. So just to clarify, I meant is that evidence the event happened as described, because they're willing to die for it? And the answer would be no. Similar to the case I saw my dead mom in the grocery store. Is the fact that I'm willing to die for it, does that increase the probability that I literally saw my literal mother?
yeah,
Or does it decrease the probability? And the answer is neither. It's just irrelevant, equally as irrelevant as whether or not I had a booger in my nose. And so
yeah.
both of the claims, I don't see how in any way that increases the probability they
Mm.
actually saw the actual Jesus. Because even if they didn't, if I'm right and it was a bereavement delusion, they would react in the exact same way. They would believe they saw Jesus and they would be willing to die for it. And so if it was a delusion, they do the exact same thing and still die for their beliefs. And so
Mm.
it literally does not make sense to me. Go ahead. Did
No, yeah.
did
I
you
mean,
disagree with
just
that?
well, you're saying that you said even if it were a delusion, they would still be willing to die for their beliefs. And I think that's a major leap to say, yes, people with delusions are willing to die for what they didn't know was a delusion. I mean, I think there's a level of confidence there that we're underselling here in terms of what they did experience. And also with the analogies you're getting, I'm keeping up, but you're jumping back and forth in some of these different analogies to saying, I have a booger in my nose, or I saw my dead mother in the grocery store, versus not only groups of people that experienced, but groups of people that were so convinced what they experienced were true that they were then willing to die, had opportunities to recant, uh, countless, I'm sure, and then didn't. But we're not limited to that. Also, I mean, we've got. I'm curious on your thoughts on the criterion of embarrassment, some of the details around the first to discover the empty tomb, the women. That was a problem. Yeah, that was actually an attack. That was literally used as an attack on Christianity in the first century, or at least the first two, to say it's probably not true because women were there first to, initially reported on discovered by women. Why would somebody making up a case in the first century add that to their, make the job more difficult for themselves, um, things like that. So we're not limited. I think the group experiences and being willingness to die for what they believe to have experienced is strong. But again, we're talking about hundreds of people according to our historical text, hundreds of people. And now you could probably say, so what if it says 500, right? That means nothing to me today. I can't go examine 500, but you could in the first century, right? If somebody made a
Well, presumably
claim,
it'd be more because it would only count the men probably. So it'd probably be more than 500.
okay, yeah,
But that's a separate question. Because my first question, this is something I'm really, really interested in, is
all right.
why do Christians think the fact that they are willing to die is relevant to anything? To me, it's equivalent to saying they had a booger in their nose. That's how irrelevant that statement is. Because I know, evidentially, the fact that someone is willing to die or not willing to die makes
Mhm.
zero difference to whether or not you should believe what they're saying. Like if someone comes up to you off the street, tells you any random fact, let's call it fact X, is the fact that they're willing to die for it give you any more evidence to believe what they're saying? Well, no, because what you should be looking at when you assess the statement is, does it correspond to reality? Does it have evidence? What is the past evidence we have that could corroborate this? Whether or not that person is willing to die is not on the list of things you should ever consider when evaluating sentence X. And so when Christians bring this in and say, "Oh, but they're willing to die for it," I'm like, that's just not one of the things we're looking for when we're trying to say what is evidence. It's completely irrelevant. And I just have never understood the fascination Christians have had with
Sure.
this fact that, oh, they're willing to die. Well, that's great, because it exactly sounds like, oh, they had a booger in their nose and they're just obsessed with this booger, and it baffles me.
But why would somebody die for a booger in their nose? I mean, I think the analogy there falls short because again, you're bringing it back to one individual. You're bringing it to something.
Oh, no, no.
Uh,
So the booger there isn't saying you would die for a booger. It's the statement that they were willing to die for the belief is as relevant to whether or not we should believe what they said as if the book said Paul had a booger in his nose at that time period. So when we read the story of Paul and he had a vision and he was willing to die for it, that statement gives us as much reason to believe his experience was um, correspondent to reality as if he had said he had a booger in his nose. That both of those statements give us equal evidence to believe Jesus actually rose from the dead, which is zero.
so, so help me understand how you would understand anything historically.
Well, we'd look for actual evidence. So like,
Okay, well, help me
um,
understand that. Help me bridge this gap a little bit.
well, so like
'Cause
evidence of the resurrection, if it happened, that would be great evidence God exists. Whether or not, let's say we have a bunch of evidence of the resurrection, but none of the apostles were willing to die for it. Would that depreciate the evidence anyway? No, it'd just be irrelevant. If we have a bunch of
Hmm.
evidence and they're willing to die for it, would that increase the evidence anyway? No, it's just irrelevant. So I'm happy to grant there is such a thing that could potentially be evidence, but whether or not they're willing to die for it is not in that category. It is not a thing that counts as evidence either way. It's just completely irrelevant. But evidence can exist, like novel testable predictions. If
Oh, historically,
Yeah,
how would we novelly how would we novelly testable make a novelty testable prediction that Pontius Pilate was the prefect of,
well, that
Jerusalem in the first century?
that wouldn't be a novel prediction. Novel something that hasn't happened yet. So like one would be the Hindu
Okay.
in the Hindu Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, maybe I forget which one. It predicts that the age of the earth is 4.3 billion years. This was written 6,000 years ago. We recently discovered this in the past 100 years. Age of the earth is 4.5. It's pretty close. That was a novel prediction. They made a novel prediction about something we didn't know yet, and they got it really close to right. 90 something percent accurate. Very good novel prediction. That's evidence. Another would be from the Bible. There's lots of stuff that claims to happen in Revelation. If that stuff happens, that would be evidence that Christianity is true. Like if the three-headed dragon comes back, or if we get all little things in our arms or whatever, I forget what all the predictions are, that would be evidence that
Hmm.
Christianity is true. So making predictions about things that haven't happened yet,
Okay.
which come true, is great evidence. Another would be if similar miracles happened as in the Bible today. So like what would be a good one? Something like where Jesus healed the blind guy. If you could say a prayer to Christianity and heal a blind guy, and we experience that today, we could test it and confirm it, then we could rationally conclude that in the Bible, when Jesus did the same thing, their eyes were healed. That's a reasonable conclusion. So we could have evidence today that this phenomenon is a real thing, and we could infer in the past, yes, this really did happen. And so if we have, there's definitely ways to provide evidence for historical events, especially in the case of things that we already know today. So things that have an empirical basis. The difficulty is you can't provide evidence for things we don't have an empirical basis for. So
Okay.
miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, until we discover those today, historical evidence can't provide evidence for them. This is actually stated in history. It's a fact. It's actually mentioned by Mike Lacona in his paper on history and miracle claims. Are you familiar with Mike Lacona?
I am. Yeah. Yeah.
So in his paper, Historians and Miracle Claims, I think is what it's called, very first paragraph, he describes this exact statement, and then he gives a massive long quote of relevant historians who are describing the exact same thing. Methodologically, history is limited to some big words that I don't remember that state that you can only infer things in history that have already been demonstrated to exist empirically, and historical testimony doesn't count for things that lack that big fancy words, which include miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs.
Okay. So based on the criteria that you laid out, would you agree that if you lived in the first century, it would then be reasonable to believe that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead?
Sure. So, like, if Jesus predicted he would rise in 3 days, and if I saw him rise in 3 days, that would definitely be evident, 100%.
So, okay. So we have evidence for Jesus or prophecy that was written before before he was alive, before his death and resurrection, before the crucifixion happened. So at what point, I mean, it's predictable just in the same way that um, you just described that we could test something and know something. But are you saying historically we would never be able to know that, and Jesus would need to die and rise again for every person that ever believed for us to even know if it was a historical event that occurred?
No. So, for us to know resurrections, or to be able to infer resurrections happened in the Bible, we would need to see resurrections today. Would it need to be Jesus? No, I don't. It doesn't need to be Jesus. Or we need to see analogous miracles that are connected to the plot line of the Bible. So, like, if you only pray to Christianity, the Christian God, or pray to Jesus, and something happens that never happens, no matter who else you pray for,
Okay.
then you could infer that is some new phenomenon that you can past impose onto what happened in the Bible. So if you pray and get limbs healed or whatever, then you can say, oh, well, then this occurring in the Bible makes sense because we see the same phenomenon today.
But you said that if the events in Revelation take place and we see them, that would be good evidence.
Sure.
With that same standard, we have prophecy that predicted the coming Messiah, his death and resurrection, that he would rise again. So I feel like we can take the same thing that you just said, apply it then, and say there was a novel, predictable, testable prediction that did happen. But then your
Oh, I would
problem
agree,
is
100%. I would agree. Problem is that I think all of those predictions fail. All those prophecies fail. They're ambiguous. They don't work. The translations don't work. There's actually most of them are wrong. But that's a conversation to have with people who are experts in uh, Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, which is not me. And so the consensus of historians is none of those are actually predictions. None of those actually work. None of them are successful. They're all pretty just vague and ambiguous, like everything else in every other religious text. But that isn't something my expertise is in. That's something you'd have to talk to experts in Greek and Hebrew and the experts in those fields who are the secular consensus, the majority of experts in those fields who know those things. I'm not an expert in those things.
okay. All right. Well, we can just disagree there, but I think that there are several strong prophecies that we have good evidence that were in fact written unequivocally before the time of Christ, like the Isaiah scroll. And Isaiah 53, I think, is one of the most powerful. We have a full copy of the Isaiah scroll at its earliest is 100 years before Christ. And we can look at passages like that and say, this is that. Not only we have that, but we have the testimony of Christ and the predictions that he made.
Well, go with Isaiah 53. So what is it about that you think is a good prediction?
Isaiah 53.
While you put up, I'm going to get some water really quick. My throat's drying out. Be back in 1 second. All right. Go for it.
So Isaiah 53 is not the prediction about the resurrection as it is the suffering servant who will come and rescue Israel. And then we have other things like Psalms 22 and verse 19 and 21.
Well, what about this do you think is a good prediction? Because I read this and say,
Yeah.
oh, look, some ambiguous phrases that could be applied to millions of people all across the world. This is not a prediction. Prediction would be like the Hindu one I mentioned, where it gives like an exact number of 4.3 billion years. That's really good. That's a really good prediction. This is just
Yeah, but
ambiguous stuff.
didn't we just, hasn't there been, I'd be curious on your thoughts on that. Hasn't there been some science recently to suggest that the universe is much older than 4.3 billion years?
Earth, only the Earth.
Oh, Earth specifically?
Yes.
All right, hang on.
Yes, the universe is like 13.8 minimum. That's the universe age.
Was that that's a recent development, right? I'm not making a point there. I'm just curious on that.
Past 100 years, yeah.
I
think it
thought
was
there was
past
something like last year
70.
with just this past year with the James Webb Telescope,
Oh,
and
this was Hubble. Hubble did this. Age.
sorry, my Bible program's being slow. Bringing up Isaiah 53. What we're going to look at in Isaiah 53 is describing the nature of the suffering servant, and it's separated as an individual. It's separated because for Israel. It's specifically for Israel by his hands. It talks about his hands being pierced, the nature in that he would suffer.
Well, like the Romans crucified some number of hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
So this really doesn't narrow it down very much. So if we just take only the people whose hands were pierced, and legs were pierced, and suffered for Israel, that's like all the Jews they killed.
I'm not aware of any that claim to be the fulfillment of these passages, though.
Whether they claim to be isn't really important. What matters is are these statements vague enough that they could apply to those people, whether or not they claim to be. So the question of what makes a prophecy significant is how many examples could it apply to? Is it vague? Because the more vague a statement is and the more things it can apply to is like making a number of guesses. So like if I say there's a guy named Bob in that direction and I don't specify a distance, then every 5 feet you could check, hey, is this guy's name Bob? This guy's name's Bob. This guy's name Bob. And you just say no, but eventually you're going to find a Bob. There's going to be some Bob somewhere in that direction. Does that mean that my prophecy was fulfilled? No, because every time you checked 5 feet and got it wrong, that was a thing that was also a part of my prophecy because it was vague and applied to all of those examples. And so it got 99% of them wrong. And just one happens to work in this case. And so the Bob believers are going to be like, oh, it was a fulfilled prophecy because this one example actually worked and turned out correct to mix with the story, when really it was just vague enough to apply to a whole bunch of examples until you found one that worked. And that's what I see in these kinds of prophecies from the Bible, is that this could apply to a whole bunch of people. We just pick one that becomes a powerful figure in religious belief and say, he fulfilled the prophecy because he became a powerful figure. It's called survivor's bias.
But then why I think we're selling short some of the rabbis and the scholars and their familiarity with the Isaiah text, because until that point, they didn't believe that the Messiah had come, even though there were, as you described, other people that could have happened too, that could have potentially seemed to have lined up, right?
It's because of survivor's bias. Survivor's bias is a really interesting phenomenon where there's a recent study done on people who do stocks, young people who do stocks. And there are some people like in their 20s who are tens, $50 million that they've made off stocks. And they're asking, well, how did you become so successful? How did you know which stocks to buy? And they give up all these reasons, which the scientist shows are just terrible reasons. There's nothing in that reason that gives you any justification or any probability to be more successful. They're just the ones who didn't go broke. They're the ones who got lucky. And so all of this storytelling, the Bitcoin followers who just follow these people and say, oh, this is my hero and I'm going to do everything they say, are emotionally attached to the survivor bias. They see this one figure who survived when many failed, and they attribute that to the success of the figure rather than the luck that was involved. The same thing applies here. And biases, there's another study that shows that the smarter you are, the more susceptible you are to confirmation bias, not the less susceptible you are. And so when you mention brilliant rabbis and things who studied this for years, the fact that they're able to make a story work in their brain is attributed to how intelligent they are, and they can find all of the ways that it fits the narrative, but that doesn't mean it actually does. Just
Did
like
you say
survivor bias.
the smarter you are, the more susceptible you are to confirmation bias?
Correct.
Do you think that could have anything to do why academia today is more atheistic in their worldviews?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Because I think the reason most of them are atheists isn't about confirmation bias. It's about the lack of evidence. I think that confirmation bias is a thing where you can selectively pick the evidence you want to see and ignore the evidence you don't want to see.
Agreed.
I think that there isn't anything they have to ignore. I think that they genuinely don't have evidence. And I don't think that's due to confirmation bias for like the reasons I'm describing to you. Like, I don't think it's confirmation bias for me to think the testimony of the apostles was bereavement delusion or communal reinforcement, because those are things that have lots and lots of evidence. We have lots of evidence of both of those things existing. We'd have no evidence essentially of miracles and magic as far as I'm aware, or if we just for the sake of the argument assume we don't. In which case, the rational thing to do, it's not confirmation bias to exclude this. The rational thing to do is to go with the thing that has lots of evidence, like a horse over a unicorn when trying to explain a hoof print. And I think that every one of the examples of evidence in the Christian dialogue is the same kind of thing. We have something that has a ton of evidence that already explains that. And so it's not confirmation bias to exclude that as evidence. It's rational because there's this other thing that already explains it significantly better. It has lots more evidence.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that the other smart people with confirmation that we would say have confirmation bias could similarly explain why they don't have confirmation bias.
Well, you just need to give an example of one of
Yeah.
the things that doesn't have more evidence for
Yeah.
a natural explanation.
No, and that's fair. That's fair. Hey, can I ask you something fun?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on aliens?
Probably exist, probably never visited Earth.
Do you think? So do you think? I know this is not necessarily. I'm just kind of curious on from your atheistic worldview. Do you expect that we will encounter some kind of like intelligent beings?
How many billions of years are we talking?
Well, I guess the magic pill for atheism is infinity time, right? You just take information times a lot of time. I'm joking.
Yeah. Well, so I think that I'm a big proponent of physics and the speed of light being the fastest way information can travel. And if light is the fastest information can travel, then in order to meet aliens, it's going to take millions, if not hundreds of millions of years.
Unless they reach out to us first, right?
No, for them to reach us, it's going to take millions to hundreds of millions of years, because the fastest information can travel is the speed of light. And the nearest, say, alternate universe, the Andromeda galaxy or whatever, is millions of light years away. So it's going to take millions of years for the aliens who have the best technology to get here.
But they could already have those millions of years behind them.
Possibly, but I doubt it. It seems like so the aliens are like, you know what are we going to do for the next 10 million years? We're going to build a spaceship and just go in that direction. Stop with nothing. We're just going to keep going because Earth is going to be there in 100 million years, and we want to mess with the silly monkeys that are there. This seems like a great investment. We're going to do it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. What? Yeah, that's interesting. I doubt from my worldview, and this is my worldview bias, I'm not ashamed to say that we would encounter intelligent alien life. It wouldn't throw a wrench in it wouldn't really raise any questions in a Christian's worldview if we encountered like an amoeba, on Mars or something like that. It would not be
Well, I think the interesting question is, what if we encountered life and they didn't know about Jesus? How would that affect your worldview?
Yeah. So I was talking with my friend Secular Rarity. We were talking about this the other day. He's an atheist. I don't think it would necessarily, like, I don't think I would feel that my Christian worldview is immediately negated by it, as it would raise some theological questions, like the gospel. Are they in need of salvation? Are they sinful creatures? Did Jesus die for the aliens too? Those kind of things would definitely come into play, but I'm not sure it would outright negate the Christian worldview, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Something else I'd like to ask you about, kind of back on topic a little bit. So I was curious to ask you about that. It's been on my mind. The alien thing is fun. Are you a strict materialist? Like all that exists is matter and energy?
I don't know what you mean by strict. I think there's only evidence for matter and energy. Does that mean that's all there is? Well, no, there could obviously be more. Like, I'm totally fine if there's a supernatural realm. It's totally possible of like infinitely other realms of other kinds of ontological stuff out there. I just don't think we have any evidence for it. So I would love for magic to be real. That'd be awesome.
So you're confident there's no evidence. So your worldview is founded on what there is only evidence for. And
Mostly, almost.
Oh, what would be the exception? That's interesting.
Well, so hypotheses in science start with you see a pattern and you try to explain the pattern.
Okay.
Doesn't mean there's evidence for it just because you see a pattern. Evidence is when you make novel predictions that are confirmed to indicate that your explanation of the pattern is correct. So all scientists, like Einstein, had a theory of general relativity. He
Mhm.
saw a pattern, he explained the pattern, and then he believed it was true before he found any evidence. He found no evidence for it until after he confirmed it with measuring the curvature of light around the sun and explaining the perihelion of Mercury and the other things he did. But before that, he still believed it because to him it intuitively made sense. It fits the pattern. He likes it. And so I'm the same kind of way. I have hypotheses about the universe, like objective morality, that don't have the hard evidence yet that I still believe. But I admit there isn't any evidence for it.
So help me understand your definition of evidence again,
Evidence is that
because it
which
seems very specific, and I'd like to understand it better.
Well, evidence is that which increases the probability a proposition is true. And in order to increase the probability a proposition is true, that means it has to differentiate itself from the alternative explanations, which there are infinitely many alternative explanations of everything. So there's this thing in philosophy called the problem of underdetermination, that every single hypothesis can explain every piece of data, no matter what. So, say you wanted to make the hypothesis that um, creationism is true and the world was created 5,000 years ago. You could say, oh, well, God just stretched out the light to make it seem like it was 4 billion years. And he placed the fossils to make us think that it was not 4 billion years old. So there's ways you can use post hoc reasoning to explain away anything, to make any hypothesis you want, explain all the data. Like I could say, we were all created 5 seconds ago and the world is actually flat. It's a flat earth. And we just have this memories of it being round because the evil leprechauns implanted those memories in us. And so you can make any hypothesis work ever for anything. And so the question is, well,
Right.
how do you differentiate your hypothesis to do something that the others can't do? If everybody can do post hoc reasoning, that won't work. What
Would
does work is novel testable predictions. That,
would
as a method, is something that not every hypothesis can do. In fact, an extremely small number of hypotheses can accurately predict the future.
so would you put string theory or some
No,
kind of
garbage.
Oh, you think string theory is
Yes,
garbage? Really?
absolutely,
Really?
100%.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. So, I guess I kind of expected you to, and I don't really know you. We haven't talked about it before. I was reading last week about from a physicist. I think I wrote his name down somewhere. Who was talking about he wished more physics students would get off the string theory bandwagon.
Yeah, because it's
Um,
terrible. It's absolutely terrible.
but it's popular right now. It makes for like there's like a Nova documentary about it. It kind of makes for better reading than whatever other theories. So, do you have a particular theory of the origin of the universe that you think fits that novel testable prediction category?
No. So
Oh,
there
okay.
aren't any that make novel predictions about the origin of the universe. There are some that make novel predictions about other things like the Casimir effect, Copenhagen interpretation, virtual particles. Those things make novel predictions and they've worked. And so the best candidate explanation for what the origin of the universe is quantum fields, because quantum fields have made novel testable predictions. Do we know if they cause the origin of the universe? No, we haven't. And that part hasn't been confirmed. But we have evidence they exist. We have evidence that they can cause energy state shifts between matter and antimatter. Virtual particles can pop in and out of existence. Could a similar event have caused the Big Bang? Yep, it's possible.
So, quantum fields would potentially be a universe generating mechanism. I mean, are in the sense that it's creating multiple universes over and over and over, or are you
Um,
avoiding the multiverse
Well, it could
theory
just
or that
create
realm?
one, so it wouldn't make a difference whether it created one or infinite. Both are possible. We just have no evidence of how quantum fields work in that way.
Yeah.
So it's possible they could create infinite. It's possible they could create one. It's possible they could create just one kind of universe infinitely, where there's just or like all universes only have puppies and one universe has humans, and that's all it is, and that's possible too.
I mean, that has been you may disagree with this, but the atheistic or the naturalistic attempt to reconcile the appearance of design or the appearance of fine tuning to say that you've got a universe generating mechanism that just generates an infinite amount of universes, and therefore the likelihood that a universe would generate a planet that's able to sustain life is probable because of the infinite variable that we could add to that?
Well, so there's two parts there. One is that that's a very common thing I hear from Christians as well, is that they think the multiverse was a solution to the fine tuning problem or a way to try to explain away God. And that's not it at all. The multiverse is a combination of two things in physics. It's a combination of virtual particles and the Casimir effect, the math of the virtual particles and Casimir effect, combined with the math of Goose early universe inflation. That's all it is. It's a combination of those two things. It has nothing to do with fine tuning. Has nothing to do with God. It's specifically just a model that combines certain math to come up with a model that's very interesting.
Well, maybe the
Um,
Christians respond to it then in that way, but I do think that there are atheists that certainly present it as a solution
sure,
to the
absolutely,
appearance of design.
absolutely, and I don't think they know enough about physics. So
Okay, that's fair. That's
the
fair.
the fine tuning argument is the fact that if we change any of the constants in the universe even slightly, matter wouldn't form. Essentially, it would be no
Or be
like
destroyed.
sure can blast into a black hole or separate
Yeah.
so fast there would only be hydrogen atoms and nothing else. And that's the question: is, well, why are all the constants so connected in such a way that they allow for this constituents of matter as they are? The best way to explain that is that they're interconnected like a Hoberman sphere. You're familiar with the weak and electromagnetic force are the same force?
No, I'm not. You'll have to educate me on that.
Okay, so four fundamental forces: strong force, weak force, electromagnetic force, gravity. Gravity isn't even a force, but doesn't matter. Two of the forces, we thought there were four forces. Two of the forces, the weak and electromagnetic force, we actually discovered are the same force. Once you get to high enough temperatures, the forces actually join and operate in the same way on the same things. They're the exact same force. And so, if you were asked the question, well, why are these two forces so finely tuned prior to knowing that they're the same force, it would be very perplexing. Like, well, they're two separate forces. We have no reason to think they're the same thing or that they would be interconnected. And then after you discover they're the same force, well, now it makes perfect sense why they're connected because they're the same thing. Um, and the same thing, there's a theory called the grand unified theory, which is trying to unify all of the fundamental forces and say, well, they're all the same thing of some other fundamental essence we haven't discovered yet. And if that's the case, that would fully explain the fine tuning because all of the forces are connected in such a way that if you change one, all the others would be affected because they're the same thing. That's the most plausible explanation in physics for the fine tuning. Um,
Mhm.
I don't. The multiverse is just is relevant. I don't,
Okay. So in my, I'm just this simple man here, T jump. So if what I'm hearing you say is all these intricacies of the universe, including the expansion after the beginning, I won't call it a Big Bang or just the beginning of the universe, were so interconnected with other factors that is only possible that it would exist the way that it is.
yep.
That sounds similar. So almost like an irreducible complexity.
I don't think so because
It seems to
irreducible
me like you
complexity.
couldn't have anything else. They must all go together. You couldn't have anything else. And I
Sure.
know
So
irreducible complexity is usually talked about in terms of abiogenesis and life in the cell and
yep.
things like that. But it sounds similar to me in terms of how everything works together in terms of what you're describing in the universe, that it couldn't be any other way.
Well,
Uh,
irreducible complexity is a different topic, I would say. But yes,
okay. Well, it just
in a
sounded
sense,
similar. It sounded similar.
I would say it's not that it couldn't be a different way. It's that the way our universe is, that the forces are connected, that it will be this way fundamentally, unless you like change the essence of the universe itself. So because all of the parts are tied together, if you change one of the parts, all the other parts will change proportionally. And so any change you make will just make a bigger universe essentially exactly the same way it is.
Hmm.
Does that mean there could be other ways the universe could be? Absolutely. Could definitely be other ways the universe could be. Not a problem. But if you're trying to explain the fine tuning, you don't need to posit infinitely many multiverses. All you need to say is that all of the laws or the laws of physics that we know about today um, could be connected in this other way, and that is sufficient to explain the fine tuning without appeal to a multiverse. Doesn't mean that this is the only way any universe could be, but the only way this universe could be.
I thought that like Hawkins, Stephen Hawking would say that the expansion of the universe had to be the rate that what it was, or else everything would just collapse and fall back on itself, and there'd effectively be no universe.
only if the other forces remain the same. So if you change one force and the other forces are the same, then yes, everything would either collapse or fall apart. But if you change all of the forces, so if you change the gravitational constant to cause things to go faster, further away, but you also increase the strong, weak, and electromagnetic force such that they will pull back together at the proportional rates, you'll get exactly the same universe. So only by changing one and not the others does it lead to a conflicting universe. If you change all of them proportionally, you get the exact same universe.
Okay. All right. So are those same principles in the universe capable of, and maybe we're jumping topics here, producing things like information?
Yeah, so Shannon information theory, a paper from 1958. Information is a product of stochastic systems. Stochastic systems means random. So yes, everything produces information. Information is just the minimum degrees of things that you require to express the properties of a system, some blah blah blah, fancy words. Yes, information is produced naturally by any system that is random. You don't need a mind for that.
How are you defining? Help me understand what you mean by inform. You said everything produces information, so that means like
Yeah.
if I hit a tree and knock off some bark, are you saying that new information is then produced
Yes.
as a
So
result?
yes.
That sounds
So
like a unique definition of information.
what's actually the consensus definition in information theory that the like, so if you cause an effect like hitting a tree and the branches fall off or whatever, the
Mhm.
branches falling off is representative of some amount of force that was applied to the branches, and that some amount of force has to be from a certain direction, a certain speed, a certain mass. So there's tons of information that was left in those fallen branches that tells you about what hit the tree, how it hit the tree, what the age the tree was, the strength of the branches. There's tons of information that was left from you hitting the tree. um, it's Information is just the representation of the information in the system. It's not actually mind driven at all. And you can actually look up the definition, because
Well,
everybody in information theory thinks information is just benign. There's no mind related to it at all. It's the Claude Shannon paper. I forget what it's called. Claude Shannon, 1958. He's the origin of information theory. So he created the terms. Um, Claude Shannon, 1958 paper.
hey,
Information.
I might even grant you that new information is granted when something happens like that, and that can happen as a natural process. But where do we see complex information in the same similar that we see as information that might be on a CD or a flash drive, like contained in DNA? Um, how is that produced in a naturally generating universe?
Well, that actually touches on what I think is the best argument for Christianity. So when we first
Oh,
discovered
okay.
DNA, um, the when we looked at it, it looks like a code, very much like a code. And so when we looked at DNA, it looks very complicated, very information oriented, as the Christians would put it. And that is a very good reason to think, oh, well, maybe this was created by a mind because it looks just like a code. And if that's all we knew about DNA, I would say, yep, Christians are right. They're justified in believing this looks like a code. The problem is that after we discovered the information of DNA, people started to go further than that. They said, well, what causes this? How is this made? And they came up with hypotheses. You got hypothesis A, intelligent design, says this looks like a code created by God. Hypothesis B, this is a product of natural processes. Now, one of these theories has been making tons and tons of progress with predictions about how these processes were made that produced this thing. And they've made predictions that they've gotten right over and over and over and over again with tens of thousands of papers that corroborate this. And one of these theories has made no progress with no predictions and just post hoc explains away the other predictions the other guys are making. And I would go with the one that's making the predictions, that's explaining all these things and giving good reasons why we should believe this. For example, there is a prediction about how RNA can form corpuscles on clay, and those corpuscles can form around the RNA, and it can become a self-producing molecule, and that RNA can become can reproduce itself, self-copy over and over again, and those copies can happen up to a certain length of 150, and that we can reproduce this by watching this specific natural process. And oh, look, we discovered exactly that. Um, the paper on RNA on clay is about the corpuscles that can form around RNA. That was a prediction that was made by naturalists about how this is formed naturally that you wouldn't expect if it was designed. If this was designed, there's no reason for nature to produce corpuscles from RNA on clay. That just doesn't, like, why? What is the purpose of this? But it's something you would expect if cells and DNA and RNA are a natural process because this would be one of the steps in the natural process. Now, of course, there's hundreds of thousands of steps. And this is just one of the steps. And we haven't come close to making all of the steps. We haven't predicted all of the steps yet, not even close. But hundreds, maybe even thousands of those steps have been accurately predicted and confirmed in a lab on the abiogenesis side. Zero of those have been predicted on the intelligent design side. And so I'm going with the abiogenesis people, which is why that's the consensus in biology.
Okay. That was a lot to keep up with, man. You mentioned like 10,000 papers, and I think we shifted to abiogenesis there. Um, could you help me understand in kind of just simpler terms for me, how not just information from branches falling from tree, but complex information that codes the color of my eyes, or the color of my hair, or how my body is going to function, arises in natural process? Not only just the presence of information itself, but an apparatus that reads that and
Sure.
understands it.
So when we talk about complex information, what we're saying is that there is something that operates in a system that if it was different in any way, it wouldn't operate in the system. So we have eyes that operate such that they receive light in and then they send it to our brain, et cetera, et cetera. And if there was no light, they wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't function. There has to be light there. There has to be these sensors for light, and then these sensors have to do something. And so complex information is a tool that is very specific and does some specific task in an environment
Mhm.
that wouldn't function if any of the things were different. So, in order to create this, you can start with a very small tool that doesn't do all of the complicated things. Those are something very simple. So, this is the evolution of the eye, which was very well documented, guessed by Darwin, confirmed by people after him with novel predictions, that there's just like a cone shape that develops because of a mutation in a snail or a slug or something. And that cone shape causes light to reflect inside of it, making it heat up more. And it heats up more, which causes them to react to go towards the warmth or whatever. Well, there's mutations that go towards it, go away from it. And the ones that go towards it find more food, because plants happen to grow in sunlight. And so there's this random mutation that causes a cone of light to develop in a snail that causes more heat to gather in that one spot. And because of random mutation, a lot of them develop in many different ways. Some go towards it, some go away from it. The ones that go away from it die. So their mutations are done. The ones that go towards it, they reproduce. So now all of them go towards it. And the same process of a small, tiny change that will be beneficial will then layer on top of one. So now they have a small cone. The small cone develops a corpuscle around it, which then fills with water, and that heats up more. And so the snails will go more towards the light. And so each small iteration becomes more and more complicated. And after a billion generations, you'll get a very complex system that has been highly specified to function in that environment in a very complex way, which you call complex information. And it just happened over lots and lots of small increments. That is very easy, because if all the bad ones, the things you would call non-complex, get destroyed, then only the complex one that functions is the one that
Mhm.
continues.
I think you accounted for Darwinian evolution nicely, but you skipped to the whole point where there is information present to begin with in the snail. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to understand better is information in our human experience. Information comes from information. Complex information always comes from complex information or prior intelligence before it. And I know Darwin didn't try to explain the origin of life. We're kind of getting into the biogenesis here, but um, I'm just curious on what it is, that natural process that gave that snail its complex information to begin with. And that's kind of the disconnect I'm having. I appreciate you taking the time to explain it to me. But to me, that seems like a huge jump. Like we go from non-life, then we have life. We go from no complex information to complex information. Um, and I'm not breaking down the, evolution too specifically there. Um,
Sure. So it's the same process. It's just for inorganic matter. So inorganic matter, some combinations of inorganic matter will be able to self reproduce. Crystals are inorganic matter that self reproduce. And there's lots of different ways to combine crystals. Some are very weak, some are very strong, some last very short periods of time, some last very long periods of time. The ones that are most the combinations of how these crystals were formed is random. Stars compress matter, create hydrogen and oxygen, then they explode, create iron, and all the other elements, and then those combine in asteroids, completely random. But some of them form in such a way that the crystals that they form will grab onto other similar formations and grow. So the ones that don't do this just spread off into helium, go off into the universe, nothing happens. The ones that do this grow. And this process of combinations of complex matter growing and combining to create new combinations of complex matter is how you go from helium and iron to all of the different inorganic compounds. There's tons of them, and they're huge and they're massive and they're complex. They're massively complex. Inorganic compounds are extremely complex. How did those form? By random chance. And the ones that don't connect in a way that is conducive to the environment break apart and die. So why did all the complex information in these organic compounds or just physical compounds come about? By random chance and the fact that they function better in the environment just like the snail does.
Yeah. I'm still not seeing, I don't see how we go from the pattern of a snowflake or a crystal or rock becomes a more and more complex rock until it has a coded information. Not only does it have information, but there also exists an apparatus to read that information. That I struggle with another gap there. I'm happy to consider, other information you've got on it.
We'll take sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid, hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen. Why does that form? Because the hydrogen atom and the sulfur atom and the oxygen atom, they stick together really well.
Hmm.
Why? So there's an apparatus that reads this. The physical structure of physics causes this combination to happen and not other combinations. There's something to read that already. It's called physics. And physics selects for these chemical compounds. There are some chemical compounds that are extremely rare. They don't happen because they break apart too easily. So there already is the reading system. The reading system is physics. The physics selects for some compounds and not for others. Some are really common, some are really rare, some never happen because they're impossible. So we already have the reading system. The question is, well, how do we get the really, really complicated ones that are a whole bunch of these combined together? Well, since it's already selecting for the base models, and the base models then combine in these ways and not other ways, and these ways, once they're created, are going to combine with the other big complicated chemical compounds. There's a system of going from the very small hydrogen, iron, helium to the very big, and it just keeps going. It just goes from these chemical compounds, which are inorganic, to combine to organic compounds, and it's just the exact same process.
So when DNA is read, I'll just say that, by another living organism, another cell, is it as the same as it's no different? It's just a chemical reaction.
Yeah.
In your opinion?
Yeah. Literally, that's literally what's going on.
Okay. I think I disagree with you there. I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate it, but it just seems to be that there's something different when two elements would interact, when two elements collide and they cause a chemical reaction, explosion, or some kind of new compound or something like that. Seems fundamentally different than when DNA exists and has the blueprints of another human being or something like that. And another organism reads that information, and maybe just, it sounded like you didn't want to call it code or something earlier, and then builds based off of that. I don't think it seems to be in instructions or plans. And I know I'm using creationist language there.
Well, it is a code. It is a code. So I'm happy to agree.
Oh, it is. Okay. So we agree with that. But that seems just fundamentally different than two elements off the periodic table reacting in a particular way.
Right. And that goes back to what I was mentioning earlier. That's a good reason to hypothesize intelligent design until the one abiogenesis, the alternative hypothesis, starts making lots and lots of successful predictions. We think it's not intelligent design. We think it's from natural processes. If it's from natural processes, here's what we would expect to see. And then they see it and see it again and over again, make more novel predictions that are confirmed over again in the lab and by multiple people all over the world. So I agree with you, the intuition that it looks like a code, and that gives us a good reason to intuitively believe it was a designer. Perfectly rational. I think that's a perfectly rational thing to say. But the reason we should discount that is because the other hypothesis has been able to make tens of thousands of novel predictions that nobody else did and confirm it in a lab, and they get it right, and they make discoveries, and they make progress over and over and over again. And so that's why I think their hypothesis is better than the intelligent design one. Your intuition is completely justified. It's very complex, looks like code. Let's hypothesize intelligent design. That's great. But then you have to go that next step and say, if it's intelligent design, what can we discover or predict that would infer or conclude that our hypothesis is correct? Not just look at the information and hypothesize you're correct. And that's what the abiogenesis side is doing. They're going beyond the hypothesis and making predictions and discoveries, and lots of them.
We'll have to look in to see what kind of predictions abiogenesis makes.
I have a paper actually, The New Scientist.
Yeah, please. I mean,
Origin of
send it to me. I'll definitely consider it. But to say that there's no, I mean, it sounds like you're saying that there's no proponents of intelligent design, or no, which would just be a Christian, I guess. Somebody that believes that God created life, not necessarily young Earth or old Earth, but somebody that believes that it required an intelligent mind to spur creation, that they just don't exist in the work of
well, no, it's not about the individual.
And...
It's about the hypothesis. Does the hypothesis make predictions? Not does the individual who believes it make predictions? Because there's lots of people who can believe crazy things who can make predictions about unrelated fields and get it right. The question is, does the hypothesis of intelligent design make predictions about things that we would expect to see? If intelligent design is true, what would we expect to see that we don't know yet?
Yes,
this is the part that go ahead.
I mean, I would say that the prediction is that anytime we see complex information and functional design, it is always preceded by intelligence and prior information and functional design. I mean, that's a prediction.
Well, sort of. It wouldn't be novel, but yes, that would be a prediction. The problem is it's already been proven false in the lab. We see complex information arise from natural processes all the time. RNA forming on clay is one example of that. That's complex information that's formed by natural processes. But even if we didn't see that, that isn't really a novel prediction, because you're looking at the things we already see and saying this pattern will continue. So like if I predict the sun will rise tomorrow, you wouldn't, the sun will rise tomorrow, therefore the spaghetti monster is real. You wouldn't count that as evidence, right? Because you're like, well, we already know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. We've seen the sun rise a billion times. Saying the same thing that we've already seen will happen again isn't a novel prediction. A novel prediction is saying, here's something we've never seen before that my hypothesis predicts that will happen. So if I said the sun will rise tomorrow and it will be purple, that's a novel prediction. That would be something that's weird that we've never seen. That would be probably evidence you may want to consider or look at, whatever my hypothesis is. So that's the difference between what you're saying is a prediction versus what abiogenesis is saying is a prediction. When they make predictions, they're saying, we don't expect RNA to form corpuscles on clay. We've never seen this. Nobody predicts this. If we're right, we're going to find this. And they look and we find it. You're predicting, here's the things we've always seen in the past. They will just continue. But that's not a prediction. That's just post-diction. You're looking at the past and saying it will continue.
All right, man. I appreciate it. I'll have to look into it more. If you want to send me that paper.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm definitely, I will definitely read it. At least skim it. I can say that. I don't know how long this paper is. I'll be honest with you, man. Yeah, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet, but I'll look what you got. And I think the prediction still stands, and I think it's relevant too for our modern experience. But I'm not familiar with what you're saying about our mRNA in terms of the complexity of the information that it contains, in terms of the natural process that it does, that causes it to form. So I just can't speak to that.
Sure.
I got another question for you, T-John, that I'm curious to ask you. So you are not a newcomer in the YouTube world. You've been around for a while. You've got an awesome following. I've seen you before in some debates on Modern Day Debate and some other places with others like Godless Girl and some other fun ones.
Pick the worst ones. Let's go. Yeah.
Really? No, I'm joking. But why the chair, man?
It's comfortable.
Okay. All right.
I had this chair since, I had my first chair since before I started my YouTube channel. It was the same exact design, but it was brown leather. It broke, so I got a new one. This one's suede, so it's actually better because it doesn't get as cold. The actual leather one would get really, really cold on the outside, and it would freeze in Minnesota winters, and it'd be really cold to sit in. This one never gets cold.
Well, I don't know. I guess I didn't finish my question there. It was like, hey, you've been in it for a while. Why don't you have some fancy, you know, LED background with like hexagons or something on the wall? It's kind of the run of the mill, but it's kind of becoming, like an identity almost. It would be weird if you didn't have it at this point,
Yep,
I
for
think. And
sure.
I saw somebody in the comments laughing at the fact I picked God, this girl. That's just a funny one. Um, yeah, I do. I will say also that another one that was pretty fire was when you debated Jay Dyer on the kill stream or whatever it was, and I actually thought that was you were not the problem there. So I will grant you that when I watched that debate.
Yeah,
If
my
you want,
favorite part of there was when he said Quine said that he never disputed that logic and math could be different. And then I just read a quote from Quine where he specifically says that even the logic and math can be doubted.
so what was the channel that was on? Is that just the nature of all the debates that happened there? I mean, the guy was saying he was like,
Yeah.
"I don't mute people. That's not what I do," and
Yeah,
it
it's
seemed like
called the kill stream. That's
yeah, just by the title of it, that it was designed just to you know
yep.
be that way. Who's your you've had a ton of people on. Who's been some of your favorite Christian apologists or philosophers that you thought make for good discussion?
Rob Collins, he was great. Um,
Rob
he,
Collins, I'm not familiar with him.
so he's somebody that William Lane Craig cites a lot as
Really?
he's like one of the top two leading experts in the fine tuning argument, like in the world. And we had two conversations. One was on fine tuning, one was on morality. And in the fine tuning one, um, he admitted that the fine tuning of the physics on its own doesn't indicate a designer at all. It's only the fine tuning plus some other argument that indicates some kind of desire or intention the fine tuner has. So, like if you have evidence there's a designer who wants a life permitting universe or whatever, like the moral argument supposedly gives God a reason to make life permitting universes, and then you have a life permitting universe. It's rational to infer that this being, which you already have evidence for in the moral argument, created that universe. Makes perfect sense. But just looking at the physics doesn't give you any reason to infer design because there's no subsequent reason to think that that particular combination would have been selected by the designer as opposed to another. I'm trying to
Hmm.
recall what he said verbatim. I have a short on my channel of just that quote. And then the actual conversation is up there too. But the point is that there's no way to differentiate this design as opposed to anything else that could have been done. There could have been a god who wanted only black holes, or a god who only wanted puppies, or a god who only wanted unicorns. And so any universe you see, you could say this universe was designed because it's hyper specific. Any way the universe is going to be exclusionary towards all the other ways the universe could be. So you could all say any of them are designed, but it's only evidence for God if you have some additional argument or evidence that indicates there's a God who has a reason to select for the things we see. Just the physics on its own gives us no such reason.
Okay, I'll have to check it out. Yeah, I'll look it up for sure.
So you did mention Presup a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah. We didn't really get into that too much there in the beginning.
Yeah, so because I don't think that the Presup argument works at all. Because the argument is that you have to presuppose a God to have any knowledge, and I don't think that's true. Why do you think that is true?
Yeah, sure. So, in a naturalistic worldview, I mean, I think the atheist or the naturalist, materialist, whatever, struggles to account for. I feel like there always has to be a so far in terms of novel testable predictions, and so the universe is what it is the way it is. This for this reason, so far, because the atheist worldview can't account for why the we've been talking about design. I'll say why the intelligible. Let's say that why the universe is intelligible, and why do I have the ability to accurately understand it? Am I wrong with that so far statement? I mean,
I'm not sure what you mean by that exactly. So, like, there's two questions there would be is what do you mean by that, and why is it important to account for something? What does that mean?
So I'm saying so far because from the Christian worldview, the universe has been designed. It's been, and not only has it been designed, it has there have been rational creatures that have been placed in it, modeled after a God with a rational creator. So I have a basis for the rationality of my mind that precedes another rational mind that comes from it. In a naturalistic worldview, I don't have that same basis for the rationality of my mind. I'm limited to my sense experience. And that sense experience is only going to get me so far. And I don't have a worldview that can account why my sense experience is going to interpret things the same 100,000 million years from now, other than it's just done it this way so far.
Well, so the so far story, something about novel predictions requiring the so far thing. What does the so far mean?
That any type of experience generates any particular result. And I could give, gravity only does what it does so far. And I have to always, if I were to be a naturalist, I would have to always incorporate that gravity may not operate the same way today that it does tomorrow. Because it's not designed. It's chaos. It's matter in motion. While as the Christian worldview affords a foundational system to say that the world works a specific way because it's intended, and it's intended to be rational. It's intended to be intelligible. Therefore, I can have great confidence then when we use a scientific method to determine something, as long as those ingredients are the same or variables are the same, probably a better term there. The outcome will always be the same because it has been ordered.
Well, so but God, a designer could have ordered it to change at a certain point. And so it doesn't seem to make a difference whether you say it's by random chance or by a designer. Either way, there's the same probability of it being the same or changing at some point.
Yeah, I don't think we look at it as probability. And when we talk about presuppositionalists, and you've had some presups on before, we look at it as an entire worldview system. And so when I argue for presuppositionally, I'm talking about for a specific God, what he has revealed, for the Christian God, what he has revealed to us. And then from there, we would answer the question of, oh, he could change it. But I think that would not be the God of the Bible. I don't think we have, through his revelation, reason to say that he would do that.
Well, also, my understanding of the argument is it could be different in the future. We have no reason to trust it will be the same in the future, because it was random or something. That seems to be the argument, because it was not designed. But there's lots of ways it could be designed to be different in the future. So you couldn't say that the reason it will be the same is because it's not designed. And you could say that it's possible that it will be the same purely by natural processes without it being designed. And that would be possible too. And so I think the point of the precept argument is usually that they have a reason to believe it will be the same because God told them or something, whereas you don't, because you don't know whether the universe will continue to be this way or not. Or you don't have a reason to believe whether it will be this way or not.
I mean, that's you're similar. I know you've had conversations with Eli Ayala, and he's probably one of the king precepts out there right now, putting out some good material into it. But yeah, I mean, I think that we're talking about worldview systems. So naturalistic worldview or Christian worldview, you have to step into a worldview in order to provide a critique or talk about inconsistencies there. But yeah, what expectation, what foundation do you have that tomorrow will be anything like today, except for the testable predictions that we've made so far, and that alone?
Well, so the question would be, why is that important? Why do you need that extra thingy?
Well, because then I would say you can't have any knowledge at all. Now, I can know with certainty the theory of relativity or how gravity works or things like that. I can know that exists. I can know things, other things, because I am designed with a brain with a rational mind that is intentioned to accurately interpret those facts and understand how the universe works. You strip away that foundation for my own rationality, you're going to be limited to just your sense experience and just the results of immediate testable outcomes. So it's kind of like how we were talking about things historically in the beginning. We talk about how can we know something historically, or it could perhaps even be justified for somebody in the first century. Let's just say the prophecies was true. it could be justified for somebody based on those predictions to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But in your worldview, it's not really necessary. It wouldn't be now because that happened way a long time ago. And the problem with miracles and understanding miracles happening in history, I think, Hume talked about we can't ever know that, or it's not ever provable. I would say that in the atheistic worldview, you would have a similar problem with things in the future because you don't have a worldview that accounts for the consistency other than particular experiments have provided particular results so far.
Well, so my question is more like, how do you define knowledge such that it requires absolute certainty? That would be the first question. And then why do you think God gives you absolute certainty?
So knowledge, I'm fine with the traditional definition, justified true belief. We know something, uh, we believe it, and we have good reason. We know something, we believe it.
We
It is
believe it's justified and
There
it's
you go.
true. Therefore, it's knowledge.
Yeah, there we go. I think when an atheist or a natural, I'll stop saying atheist. I prefer other terms like naturalist. I think it's better. But when a naturalist says that they know something, there's always going to be that limited factor to it. And because of the amount of uncertainty in the rest of the universe. And then there's other arguments in the presuppositional world, and I'm not the best, precept.
Well, I wanted to start with this one because this one I think is really
Oh,
interesting.
okay.
So I agree, justified true belief, standard definition of knowledge is fine. So I have a belief the world is round. I'm justified by my knowledge of science or whatever. And if it's true, the world is round, then I have knowledge. Now I don't have certainty, the knowledge that the world is round. We could be in the Matrix. I could have been created 5 minutes ago in Magic Leprechauns. But if it's true the world is round, I have a belief and it's justified, then I have knowledge. So even if I don't have certainty, I can still have knowledge. Because knowledge doesn't require certainty. It's the consensus in both science and philosophy. It's called fallibilism. You don't need certainty to have knowledge. And so even though I could be wrong, if it happens to be true the world is round and I have a justification and a belief, I can still have knowledge. And so you don't actually need this thing that presuppositionalists seem to have added, which is this criterion of infallibility to have knowledge in the first place. So if you're going based off justified true belief, then you don't need certainty to have knowledge, in which case you can have knowledge in a worldview without knowing what the fundamental nature of reality is. Because if you have some justification, you have a belief, and it happens to be true, you have knowledge.
But you brought in a lot there in terms of understanding how the world is round and things like that through processes of science, which is your sense experience, and the sense of experience is others. How do you justify those processes of science, and how do you justify that your sense experiences are accurate, aside from they just seem to produce similar results? I mean, maybe that's what it is.
Well, the just seeming to produce similar results is a justification. So if I'm basing my belief purely based off of that, I could be wrong, but that's still a justification. So if I have a justification, the world is round based off of past experience, and I have a belief based off of those justifications, and it happens to be that that's true, well, then I have knowledge. I don't need anything else. I still have knowledge with just the past information thingy induction that you're mentioning.
And it's only justified so far as that those tests continue to bring about the same predictions.
Well, no, in this case,
Or
it would be justified forever. So I would be justified in believing forever the world is round, or gravity works the way it does, or the sun will rise, or whatever, based off my past experience. So I have a belief the sun will rise tomorrow forever, even though it won't. It doesn't matter. I have a justification for that, which is my past experience. I have a belief based off of that past experience. And suppose it was true. Suppose that in some magic universe, the sun would literally just keep going around and forever. Then it would be true. So I have knowledge. I have knowledge that the sun will rise forever because I have a justified true belief, even though I've made no claims about the fundamental nature of reality. I don't know if it was made by God.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're in the Matrix, but I still have a justified true belief. And so I have knowledge even without certainty.
But again, that belief about the sun rising or the globe or whatever it is limited to your sense experience. And why do you trust your sense experience other than it has done things for you like predict the sun is going to rise again and again and again, which is kind of, we're going circular now. You're saying you trust your senses because they make accurate predictions. Because there's accurate predictions, you trust your senses.
Well, I'm going a step further in the argument. So I'm saying induction is a justification. If induction is a justification, then I can have knowledge via induction. In which case, precept argument seems to fail, because if induction works as a justification, then I can have knowledge, my senses work, the world is round about pretty much everything just fine. And I don't need this extra thing that presuppositionalists are implying that we need, which is this connection to the fundamental nature of reality. And they're saying if we don't have this, then you can't have knowledge. But if I can have knowledge with induction, which is what they're specifically saying we can't have, then that defeats the argument. And so if induction counts as a justification, that means I have a belief and it's justified. And whether or not it can be true is a fact of the universe, it has nothing to do with me. If I have those three things, I have knowledge, which means knowledge is possible with just induction. And so the precept is going to have to say induction doesn't count as justification because reason, insert reason.
Why? Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. Why would anybody grant you just induction as justification? I would say induction needs justification.
Sure. But the question is, so you're saying knowledge isn't possible via induction?
So if we're on the same page here in induction, would you say induction is the consistency that the same things happen today in the same fashion, in the same way,
Yes.
tomorrow, in the future?
Yes, that's what, yeah.
And I'm not a philosopher, man, in my simple language.
Sure.
My simple language. Yeah. So I think that needs justification. That tomorrow is going to be anything like today. That 100 years from now, in terms of behaving the same things in the same ways. And the Christian worldview has a foundation that supports that. And I'm not sure I've seen that the materialistic, atheistic, naturalistic worldview has a similar justification of induction. Maybe you feel like induction doesn't need to be justified.
Right. So that's the question, is why do you think induction needs to be justified for it to be knowledge? So let's say it's not justified. Let's just say I wake up tomorrow, live for 100 years or whatever, and see the sun coming up every day. Why would I not be justified in believing the sun will continue to go up indefinitely?
You are justified in believing that insofar that your sense experience is accurately interpreting what's going on. And so you have to presume that your senses are accurately interpreting that. And the only way you do that is by the same test that you're describing. So,
well, let's just say I presuppose my senses are working.
Great. Okay. What's the presupposition justification for that, and how does it fit into your worldview?
Well, presuppose by definition means it's not justified. You presuppose mean you assume it's true before the argument begins, so there's no justification.
I think I heard an analogy that I thought was helpful. So you and me, I'm a Christian, and you're a naturalist, and we're looking at there's a hill in front of us, and there's a house, right? We can see sticking up behind the hill. When we justify things, I'm laying down a worldview that describes what's beneath the roof of that house and how it's being held up. So we're both seeing the same things. We're seeing the sun come up. And I would say Christians have more consistent worldview in explaining what is foundationally necessarily true in order for understanding that. Just like we're both trying to explain what's holding up this house that we're both seeing. So we both see the sun come up. We're both seeing that. So I'm saying, you see a roof and a chimney there. You need to be able to explain in your worldview what's holding up that roof and the chimney, what's beneath it.
And my question is why? So why can't I say I believe there is a roof and a chimney, and that not be knowledge without this underlying belief? So suppose I know nothing about what's underneath the house. I say I believe there is a roof. Right?
Yeah,
I can see it. That's my justification. So I have a belief, I have a justification. Now, if it's true that there's a roof there, even though I could say we could be in the Matrix. I don't know if we're in the Matrix, but I believe there's a roof. I see a roof, and that's my justification. May not be a good justification. I don't really care. If it's true, that's knowledge. I still have knowledge. So even if I don't know anything about what's below the house, I see the roof. I have a belief about the roof. I have a justification about the roof. And if it's true, whether or not I know it, that's still knowledge. I still have knowledge, even though I've never claimed anything, because that's justified true belief. Why would that not be knowledge?
Yeah. I think the difference there is perhaps a level of knowledge. I mean, a postmodernist, I don't think you're a postmodern.
No.
That's good. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but they would say they know things too, and yet their definition of knowledge would likely be in contradiction with somebody else that has a knowledge claim, and they're totally fine with that. And so you can know things in your atheistic worldview. Gosh, I keep saying that. I need to train my brain to stop saying that. It's not, but anyways, I digress. You can know things, but it is to a much more limited degree, and I think it's inconsistent with how we live life.
Well, I don't know what you mean there. So the degree thing I kind of agree with, because I think I don't require certainty, so I can have knowledge with 51% or whatever justification, or that'd be fine, and still have knowledge. And so even if I have a lesser degree, because I don't think certainty is required for knowledge, degrees are perfectly fine for knowledge. In which case, I have knowledge and I don't need God. Now, the second question would be: is it possible to have absolute certainty without God? Is it possible to have that level of certainty without God? I would say yes, for certain things. For something, I think, therefore I am. I exist. I can know I exist without presupposing a God with 100% certainty. And so the two claims there is, one is, if we can have knowledge with a lesser degree, but it's still knowledge, well, then you don't need God for knowledge. And is it possible to get that level of knowledge that you're talking about without a God? I would say yes. Not necessarily for everything, but I don't really care about that. All I need is one example. If I can get one example of knowledge that's at the same level that you believe God provides, then you don't need God for knowledge. And I can do that. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I can know I exist with the same level of knowledge that you think God provides.
When you say you think, therefore you are, I'm thinking about that for a second, T-Jump. Is the level of that certainty the same if in fact you were in the Matrix?
Yes, I would still exist. I would just be in the Matrix and still exist.
But not in the same kind of capacity as if you weren't in the Matrix.
Well, the way I exist is irrelevant to the argument. The only claim of the argument is that I exist. So whether I exist as a matrix or a brain in the vat or a spirit goo doesn't make a difference. I still exist.
Okay. Perhaps that's the problem then. Perhaps the problem is that you know that you exist in kind of a simple existence that isn't the individual, but I've got a feeling you probably don't believe in a soul or a immaterial mind or anything like that.
Sure.
You exist, but not in a way that there is a unique self. Perhaps that's not a problem for your worldview, though.
Well, I mean, I could go further and make more claims, but the only point here is that was the question.
I see what you're saying. If you can demonstrate that singular point,
yeah,
if you can know that, then you can know.
Yeah, if I can know that without a God, then I don't need a God. I don't need to presuppose a God to have knowledge at the level that you're talking about.
So I guess I would have to consider the "I think, therefore I am" statement to be fundamentally true. Could you prove that statement to be true?
Yes, I cannot believe I exist and be wrong.
You cannot believe you can exist and be wrong. How do you prove that statement?
Because if I have a belief that I exist, there has to be some capacity of something existing for that belief in reality. So if there is a belief that I exist, that belief exists in reality, therefore it exists. So there's no way for it to exist and not exist at the same time.
Hey, I agree with that. The laws of logic are real and absolute, man. They're immaterial and they exist, and we don't have to go there.
Well, I actually agree. They are immaterial. They're abstract objects, but they don't exist.
But we use the laws of logic outside of the human brain to correct the way that the logic operates inside the human brain operating.
Sure. Same way we use English to correct children's use of commas.
But English changes over time.
So does logic.
Does it?
Indeed. Classical, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Classical Logic, Section 1. Logic is a formal language and a system of semantics. And there are actually multiple kinds of logics, some that reject the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. Like
It
fuzzy
says
logic, many-valued logic, quantum logic.
it
Um,
it says logic is language.
Logic is a formal language with a system of semantics. So the first
Hmm.
sentence, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Classical Logic.
So both A and not being the same type of thing in the same way, or meaning the same thing in the same way. We could come up with a different word for that, and maybe it wouldn't necessarily be logic, but the principle there that's embedded within there is still true.
Well, no, that's the second thing I mentioned. There are other kinds of logic that reject that. So, like many-valued logic, I think rejects the law of excluded middle. I think
Mhm.
fuzzy logic rejects the law of non-contradiction. I don't remember which one rejects the law of identity. I don't accept. I think standard logic is correct, but there are many different kinds of logics that can all work to describe the fundamental nature of reality. So, like quantum logic, where you can have things that are fundamentally both true and false at the base level, but they can combine and collectively mutate into what we see around us, essentially. So if we look at the fundamental particles, it's not true that they exist. They both exist and don't exist, but that quantum state collapses in such a way that it produces what we
Well,
see
hey,
around us.
what exists and what exists and doesn't exist at the same time?
Particles.
But even if we would argue that particles come into existence without a cause, which is usually the argument, right? There is still a time when they don't exist until
Well,
they do.
well, no, I'm saying they both exist and don't exist exactly now. Like all of the things that make us up, they don't exist and they exist at the same time. That's it's Quantum logic is very weird. Um,
I'll say maybe I'm not following you there. Is that limited to particles, or could that be an individual that also exists and doesn't exist at the same time?
Depends on which model you use. I think the model is specifically saying it's limited to particles, but you can have like a certain layer of reality which has things that are both true and false at the same time. But if they can interact in such a way that produces a coherent system, then you can have a world that appears standard logic-y, even though fundamentally the standard laws of logic are untrue. And that's the point of the argument. I don't think it's true. I think standard logic is true, but
Okay.
it's not the only one. And so I think that logic is a description of how reality operates, how reality is. But the laws themselves don't exist any more than if I said the sky is blue. The sentence, the sky is blue, doesn't exist. It's a description of the way reality is. So the fact that something is itself and is not itself is a feature of reality. It's not some external non material law that governs reality. It's just a physical manifestation of the fields of reality.
All right. I'm trying to keep up with you, man. You're clearly a more well versed philosopher than myself. But yeah, okay. Now I won't say anything else on that.
All right, so to go back to the I think therefore I am, I can know that with absolute certainty without appealing to a God. Doesn't matter if God exists, God doesn't exist, I can still know I exist.
And you said you know that, and you said I asked you how you could prove that, and you said you could prove it how. I believe it's true, and it couldn't be wrong, or something like
I
that.
I can't believe I exist and be wrong.
I can't believe I exist and be wrong. Is that fundamentally true?
Yes.
Is that metaphysically true?
Yes.
So you're not a materialist then? You do believe in immaterial.
So metaphysics is the fundamental nature of reality. Even if you're a physicalist, physicalism would still be metaphysics because metaphysics doesn't literally mean beyond physics. That's just how the what's it, the anatomy of the words. But the anatomy of the words isn't what the word actually means. So, like the word atom, the anatomy of the word is that's the smallest constituent part. Atoms aren't the smallest constituent things. They're made up of protons and neutrons and electrons and gluons. So the fact that the word means the smallest constituent part isn't representative of the definition of the word. Metaphysics is the fundamental nature of reality, whatever that is, which could be physical. And if physicalism is the fundamental nature of reality, the word metaphysics would refer to physicalism.
Okay, but I mean that's something that is true, that I believe it and couldn't be wrong, or I believe it, could not believe it. What did you say, man? Sorry,
I
we've been
can't
going for a while.
believe
I'm
I
getting
exist
tired.
and be wrong.
Yeah, I can't believe I exist and be wrong. That is a fundamentally true statement that
Yes.
is absolutely true and immaterial.
It's abstract. Abstract sentences are abstract.
Okay. All right. No, I'll have to look into that, man. I don't have much more I can speak to that.
Sure. Well, so then my second question about precept that I'm most interested in is,
All right.
how does belief in God give you the certainty that you think it does? Because to me, it sounds like belief in God, not only would it be equally as uncertain as the naturalist worldview, but it would be even more uncertain.
In that same sense, I almost think it should be easier for you to believe that Jesus wasn't miraculously raised from the dead, but came back from the dead in some kind of natural process, because it seems that your worldview could account for it. While in my worldview, I would say miracles are rare and infrequent, and therefore, in a way, I have more reason to be skeptical towards them than a naturalist should. I think that would be consistent. I think that would be consistent in naturalism.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Where you would have a reason to doubt it was a miracle because you, even in your worldview, you think miracles are unlikely. But how does that go back to my question that in the presuppositionalist worldview, how does believing in God give you certainty when you think that in a way that differentiates it from how naturalism
Okay.
gives
Yeah,
uncertainty?
yeah, yeah. I think it goes back to the nature of God. So again, when somebody argues presuppositionally, they're arguing for the Christian God, for the triune God Yahweh, and His nature, and that goes along with that. Through the Scripture that He is revealed, which again is just true in the Christian presuppositional worldview. We believe what He says about things that He has created. Uh, Within that, there's no framework to say that the world will be fundamentally altered from the way that operates today, except in the new heaven and the new earth. And when I say fundamentally altered, I mean the way that we expect elements to interact with each other and things like that. It is a designed universe. It's been designed for humans to explore, to have a dominion over. Um, all of it has been for us to interpret. We're made in God's image with His rational mind, and with a rational mind and intelligibility and things like that. There is no expectation that Yahweh, given us the universe that we do, would fundamentally change that. You could conceive of a worldview with a universe where there is a deity that would do something like that, just to change it all, but not in the Christian worldview.
Well, so it seems like you presuppose the existence of a thing that would make the universe the way you would want it to be. But I could just do the same thing. I could presuppose, let's say, just to make a silly name, the magical potato law, and the magical potato law makes the universe consistent and uniform or whatever. Why would not, just making something up? Obviously, there's not, it wouldn't count as knowledge, right? You couldn't say, because I made up this law that makes the universe the way I want it to be, and I want it
Mhm.
to give me knowledge, therefore I have knowledge. Doesn't really work. So how does presupposing a God just designs things the way that is convenient for your knowledge any different than presupposing a magic potato law or something different that just gives you knowledge?
The first problem I think with that is that you have to step out of your worldview in order to create a problem for the Christian worldview in the presuppositional sense.
Well, no, so I'm hypothesizing there's two individuals here.
Mhm.
One is a Christian who presupposes a God. One is a magic potato law who presupposes the magic potato.
Okay, well, we could use a real religion, right? How would I presuppositionally argue against another claim of deity, Mormonism or Islam, like the two we talked about earlier?
Well, I'm specifically going for just one that makes it so knowledge is possible and nothing else about the religion, because that's the part that's important to the argument. So like the only thing that matters is there is this magical potato law that makes the universe consistent and intelligible, essentially.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the revelation in Scripture and talk about the intelligibility that we've been given, that Revelation describes, not the Book of Revelation, but just God's revelation. And then I would critique the potato idea based off of the same revelation, or the same claim of revelation, and what that revelation says about the nature of the potato God that you're claiming. So it's not that I would sit in the Christian worldview and then look at your potato God, but I would step into your potato God claim and talk about why it doesn't work in that. So we could come up with, I think, hypothetical claims of gods, but it's a worldview comparison, not a piecemeal comparison, at least in the presuppositional perspective.
Well, the question is like, so you can, because presupposition means that you assume something is true before any argumentation, before any experience, before any revelation. You assume it's true.
Yeah, that's necessarily true. Yeah, that's what presuppositionalists would say.
Well, sure, you assume that it's necessarily true. And so if you assume Christianity is necessarily true, and the potato guy assumes the potato law is necessarily true, why would he not be equally as justified as you are? Because they both, it seems like the entailment there is that in order to be justified, you need to presuppose something that makes the universe uniform. If you presuppose something that makes the universe uniform, you have the ability to have knowledge or something like that. But that doesn't seem to follow, because whether or not you presuppose something being there is irrelevant to whether it actually is there.
So why wouldn't the potato god, if you have knowledge in the potato god universe, what reasons do you have to believe that your potato god would not fundamentally alter the universe that exists as you know it?
It's necessary. It's a part of his nature.
Okay. Is the potato god loving?
I don't think that would be required for a uniform universe.
I think it would be necessary that the potato god is loving if he gave expectations on creatures to be able to intelligently discern a design universe, if that was the expectation he gave, and then somehow altered the expectation that he had given them for what reason?
Well, so I'm trying to make it as minimal as possible. So the only thing that would be required is intelligibility and knowledge possible. So we can say there just isn't any love in this universe or whatever. That wouldn't bother me all that much. All that seems to be required is about, can I presuppose a magic potato god that gives us intelligibility and knowledge? And if I can do that, then God isn't required for knowledge, because there's another hypothesis that doesn't include the love thing or whatever that still gives us knowledge. And so to me, it seems like the act of presupposing a thing is no different no matter what you're presupposing, because it doesn't make a difference. Whether or not you presuppose there is a thing that grounds knowledge, again, doesn't seem to have any relevance to whether or not you actually have knowledge. It seems as irrelevant as the booger thing from previously. And so I don't see how the act of presupposing there is someone who organizes the universe in any way gives you more grounding for knowledge, because whether or not you have knowledge exists independently of your presupposition, because knowledge is justified true belief. If you have a justified true belief, you have knowledge, and that the fact of whether or not you have knowledge is true independent of whether or not you're justifying anything or you presuppose anything.
So I think I'm trying not to pay attention to the comments too much, but somebody said that precept is circular. And in a way it is. I actually don't have a problem with that. I think any claim of knowledge is ultimately going to be circular, right? Would you agree with that statement? Any knowledge claim will ultimately be circular?
Any knowledge claim that's contingent on abstracts would be circular, but if it's contingent on concretes, it wouldn't be. So like if I claim, I think therefore I am or something, I have an experience, I'm seeing a TV, and so I believe I exist because I have this experience. That's not circular, because I'm not justifying my existence from my existence. I'm justifying my existence from the experience I'm having, which is a thing. And that's not justified by anything. There's nothing justifying the experience. It's literally a thing that exists.
I mean, it sounds like you're justifying your experience, or you're justifying your existence by your existence.
Well, no, because I'm not using my existence to justify that I exist. I'm using my experience to justify that I exist. So I experience a TV, and that experience is an existing object. It's like a physical thing in my world. Experience is a physical thing. And so it's like a rock. It's a thing. It's literally a thing that's right there. This experience, it's a thing that exists in reality. And this experience I'm using to justify that I exist. But the experience is justified by nothing. I'm not justifying the experience. The experience is just a thing that exists. It's there. Like, whether, again, that would be true whether or not you're physical or a spiritual. Your experience of reality is a thing in reality. It's literally an existing thing that is there. And that's not justified by anything. It's not an argument that goes in a circle. It's like, there's the core, and then from that you can get other things.
So I think, therefore, that I get that you're saying that's a singular point that must be fundamentally true, or is fundamentally true. But I mean, is that not a circle? I mean, I guess you would have to say a circle has multiple points on it, but that's an initial point that everything's eventually going to come back to, right? Like yourself, you've got a circle of knowledge. It's going to be you in here, and whether you read scientific papers like we've talked about, whether you do experiments yourself, you do other things, you're going to proceed through those knowledge claims, and you ultimately come back to yourself, the "I think, therefore I am" statement, as the ultimate authority on what experiments are good, what scientists are good. Not to lost my headphone there. Not to trust one scholar over another. You could say that you trust scholars, right? That the mass majority of people don't embrace intelligent design or something like that. But it's always going to come back to the "I think, therefore I am." It's always going to come back to T-Jump as the arbiter of what's good science, of what's good. It's either going to be you or it's going to be somebody else.
Well, no, that's not a circle. That's a line. So it starts with a single point, "I think, therefore I am," and then builds off that in a line. But that's not a circle. Circular reasoning is when your premise is in your conclusion. When you're using one of your premises as the conclusion. So that's a circle because it starts with the premise and then it ends back at the premise. That's a circle. You're correct that in my worldview, you start with cogito as the starting point, but then it goes in a line from there. It never comes back, and it's like the cogito is justifying itself. That's never a thing. That's the starting point. And so when someone in the comments says that presuppositional is circular, what it means is that one of the premises of your argument is in the conclusion of the argument. So
yeah, I get that.
So that would be the difference. Mine wouldn't be. Mine is it's the starting point. It's a straight line, but there's no circle. It doesn't come back on itself ever.
So you could call that an axiom, right? I guess would that fit the definition? I think, therefore I am. Would that fit the definition of what you would say an axiom is?
I think axioms are typically abstract, and that would not be.
There we go. Yeah, you dropped. It was just me alone for there. I was about to preach the gospel, man. I was about to to your audience.
That's all right.
I'm joking.
I think therefore I am wouldn't be an axiom. The axiom would be the experience would probably be more analogous to the axiom in my worldview. The experience is the axiom.
But if you don't take it as an axiom, then you start to build the circle. I feel like if it's a necessarily true belief, and the statement itself justifies it or doesn't need.
It's justified by the experience. So the experience is the starting point. That's the first premise, and from that I get the statement. I exist, or I think therefore I am.
So you've got an experience, and that experience justifies T-Jump.
Yeah.
But T-Jump has to exist to justify the experience, to have the experience.
Yes, that's a fact, but that wouldn't be circular because that's not one of the premises. That's just saying the same thing twice. So like if I have an experience, that experience is a thing, right? And then from that experience, I can say sentences like descriptions of the experience. There's some difference between the TV and the camera. And so one of the sentences is, "I think, therefore I am." So that sentence is describing the experience. And so it's not that it's a circle, it's describing the experience. The only thing, it's not that the experience exists because of this sentence. That would make it circular. If the experience was true because of this sentence, then it would be circular. So it's only a circle if the premise is true because of the conclusion is true because of the premise. If it's just describing in one straight line, it wouldn't be circular.
I still see that as kind of circular. I mean, T-Jump must exist to have the experience. We know T-Jump exists because of the experience. I mean, that gets us back to T-Jump there. You can have a line, but it's like T-Jump experience equals T-Jump, or knowledge of T-Jump perhaps. But I think that's the point I'm making, is that knowledge claims will be circular.
Well, think about it this way. Does my experience depend on the sentence? Like, does my I think therefore I am. If I didn't say I think therefore I am, would I still exist?
Yes.
Right. So the sentence, this argument that I'm presenting, isn't something that makes me exist. I don't exist because of this sentence.
No,
Therefore,
but the experience is what is how you know you exist, and you couldn't exist without the experience.
well, no, the experience is just a thing that exists. And then from that, I can then make description sentences. But there's nothing that justifies that experience. There's nothing that comes back to it. There's nothing, it's on its own. If I say nothing, it still exists. If I do nothing, it still exists. If I know nothing, it still exists. It's a thing on its own. It needs no other things. I can go to other things from that, but there's no circle there. It's just a single thing. The existence is there. And then from that, I build other stuff, but the other stuff doesn't matter. What matters is the existence. That's the core starting point. So it's not circular. The existence isn't circular because it's just a thing. It's a single thing.
Well, maybe I'm saying existence when I meant to say experience. TJUP exists, therefore there's experience. You know TJUP exists because he has the experience. Therefore, TJUP exists.
So
is that any different than? And I'm just thinking through this, man.
So like, to give you an example, a circular argument would be is Socrates is a man. Men have hair. Socrates has hair. Socrates is a man. The first premise was Socrates is a man. The conclusion is Socrates is a man. They're literally the same thing. Now, a non-circular argument, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal isn't in the first premise. It's a different thing. It's inferred from the first thing. It's connected. So Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. So then that's not a circle, that's a line. Now, obviously, there's Socrates is in all of those sentences, which kind of looks like a circle because there's Socrates in the first one and there's Socrates in the last one, but that's a line. And so using I have an experience, I can't believe I exist and be wrong. That's a line. That's like the all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is a man. There's different things. They all have the same thing in mind. Like it's all relevant to the same topic, but it's not circular reasoning. In the case of presuppositionalism, it's only it's only possible to have knowledge if God exists, or if you presuppose God. I presuppose God, and so it's only possible for me to have knowledge if God exists. It's like the same thing, both in the front and the back. And so it seems like the way you got to the knowledge that it's only possible to have knowledge if you have God is because it says so in the source material, the presuppositionalism or whatever. And because that information came from the ideology itself, that's the first premise. The first premise is in presuppositionalism, you get this knowledge that only presuppositionalism can have knowledge. The conclusion is only presuppositionalism can have knowledge. That's the circle that the guy in the chat was talking about. Whereas that doesn't exist in mine, because I'm not saying the source material doesn't say anything about anything. It's just an experience. There's nothing, there's no other entailments of it other than it's there.
Okay. All right. I appreciate it, man. I don't think we're going to make any ground there anymore.
Sure.
But yeah, that was interesting. You definitely gave me some stuff to consider, think about.
Cool. Well, we've been going for about 2 hours. Do you want to wrap up pretty soon? Do you want to give any links or references about your YouTube channel, your Facebook group?
Yeah, sure. So my YouTube channel, again, Conversation with Christians. My goal is to equip Christians with good theology and apologetics, just to have confidence to speak about their faith in everyday dialogues. I upload occasionally there, but I really enjoy this kind of stuff. Sparring with you, TJUP, has been fun. And again, if you're already in the Nashville area, check out the Conversation Coalition. We do things once a month, and we would love to have you out and listen in. We do it's always an hour discussion followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. And if you really feel passionate, come a few times and might be able to participate up on the stage one day. We're always looking for new people, fresh minds to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. And let me know if there's anything I can do to help expand, because I do want to make more of those specifically here. That'd be great. So if there's anything,
Yeah, for sure.
anybody you know in Minnesota who we can start another one up, let me know.
Yeah, well, for sure. We're still kind of trying to figure out like how to make this whole thing like work and be sustainable. Um, so we're still in the experimental phase, but pretty soon I think we'll have a novel testable prediction on a good formula for the Conversation Coalition, and I'll definitely share that with you, man.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. It was great having you on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.
All right, thanks, T Jump.